Hello and welcome to our weekly APA review week 2 introduction. I changed my mind in between the first one that I recorded and this one and decided that instead of giving you the key as a video, I'm going to give you a brief summary of the rules, and I'll try to do that each week. So this week our topic is bias-free language. And the general rule is that you want to write in a manner that is free of bias and biased language. The important thing to remember is that you want to be respectful about the individuals that you're writing about, but keep in mind that these rules aren't hard, fast rules like they are for, say, numbers or italics. The language can change over time. So what's acceptable today may not be acceptable in a year or two. And what was acceptable a couple of years ago may not be acceptable today. So bias-free language can be hard to manage, but try your best. So now we're going to go to our APA style guide. All right, so here we are. And basically, again, the important thing to remember is that these are just kind of general guidelines. They can change over time. The idea is to be respectful. And I'm just going to go over a few of these. You can see there's all these different categories here. And I really do, if you have the APA manual, I really highly recommend reading through it, bookmarking some things, highlighting some things, and definitely bookmarking this page so you can refer to it while you're doing your own writing if you come across different things that I don't go over. So a couple that'll be very relevant to most likely your own articles that you read and then are going to write about, as well as your own study, is age. You know, the idea is there's different terms for different age groups. So a person, individual, that's relevant for somebody of any age. Participant, those can refer to anybody. But when you're referring to the use males and females, that would be broad. That could be somebody of any age, right? Whereas men and women would be somebody who is an adult. So it's important when you're talking about somebody who is 12 or younger, it's appropriate to refer to them as a child or a boy or a girl. You could also be more specific: transgender girl, transgender boy, cisgender girl, cisgender. Those are also acceptable. And then obviously infant for very young. When you're talking about somebody 13 to 17 years old, you wouldn't want to refer to them as a boy or girl. They're an adolescent or a young person, or a young man or a young woman. Okay, so you don't want to refer to someone in that age as either 13 to 17 as either a boy or girl or a man or a woman, because they're not an adult yet. And then 18 and older, the appropriate terms would be adult, man, woman, or you can be more specific in terms of transgender, cisgender, etc. And then when we're talking about older adults, it's important to remember that there's certain things that are just have more of a stereotype or condescending, like seniors, elderly, aged, things like that. You want to refer to them more as older people, older adults, older individuals, persons 65 and older. Those are a little bit more acceptable and obviously free of biased language. So then here, just if you keep going down the APA style guides, it tells you kind of some of the things that are problematic. So the elderly, older adults would be preferred. Specific ages, old men, you'd want to call them older men. That's just a little bit more kind, or men between a specific age. And I just want to point out too is that if age is included in something, it could be that it's very relevant to the topic. And so just because an age range is there, that's not necessarily what's wrong when we come across our war activities, right? It could be more the language that is used. All right, so now we're going to go to our next specific guide, and we'll do disability. Now here, again, this can be very specific to specific groups, okay? So there's something called person first language and identity first language. Now I don't have the time to go over both of these, but I really do recommend reading through the style guide or the APA manual to understand a little bit better. But the idea is sometimes if you put the person first, it's not as biased, it's not as kind of looked at as a label, right? But there are some groups that prefer to have identity first language. They want their disability to define them. So deaf individuals would prefer that, blind individuals would prefer that, and so that's important to keep in mind. And again, choosing between it is very difficult. It's kind of this idea that if you're unsure, you could look out to the different groups that may support those individuals with those specific disabilities and see what's preferred. I would also say probably person first language is preferred unless you know that they really do prefer that identity first language. The relevance of mentioning a disability, in many studies it's very relevant, especially if they're looking at that particular population. Just calling it a disability in general may not be good enough. You don't want to say disabilities in general if they're looking at specifically one group of individuals, people with epilepsy or people that have had a traumatic brain injury. You want to make sure that those specifics are noted because those are very different groups of individuals. We want to avoid things that are labeling and things like that. I'm just going to go down here to, again, kind of these examples of bias-free language. So problematic would be somebody that's special needs or physically challenged. You could say a person with a disability or a person with a mental illness if it was somebody you're talking, instead of using mentally challenged or mentally ill. People who are deaf prefer that identity first language, so deaf person or a deaf blind person would be okay. And they didn't have it down below, so I just want to point it out here that, again, this idea of using person first language, so a person with paraplegia is preferred to calling them a paraplegic, which labels them, or a youth or an individual with epilepsy rather than an epileptic. Because again, this referring to them as epileptic, that's labeling them with their disability. That's identifying them as, they are what that disability is. Saying that it's a person or an individual with epilepsy gets away from that. So just keep that in mind. That's that person first language. Another thing that they kind of mentioned down here is negative and condescending terms. And so, anything that might be a slur or that has some sort of negative stigma associated with it. Instead of brain damage, you might use a person with a traumatic brain injury. But I also want to point out that term normal control. We see that a lot, especially in older articles, you'll see that. Language changes over time. So you may see that, but going forward, instead of using the term normal control, you might want to say, if it's looking at individuals with epilepsy, the study examined participants with and without epilepsy. So you get rid of that normal control, because he's saying normal control denotes that the other group is abnormal. And you're also being concise by saying with and without rather than saying participants with epilepsy and participants without epilepsy or something like that. So you're more concise if you say with and without. I'm not going to go over the gender one, but I do suggest reading through it. Socioeconomic status, just because I know you have one on the war activity that refers to that. And sometimes, really reporting socioeconomic status can be important to a lot of different topics that you're going to be reading about. Some studies may report it and some studies may not. But what we want to avoid is, again, those kind of negative or stereotyping terms, calling a group of individuals homeless or ghetto. So if we get down here, here's some examples. So description of legal status. Problematic would be the undocumented. Again, that's labeling them, right? So here maybe you say person first language, individuals who are undocumented or people who are undocumented. Looking at income, something problematic would be the poor or poor people. Instead, refer to them as people whose incomes are below the federal poverty threshold level. That's much more descriptive, first of all, or people who self-reported income in the lowest income bracket. Again, much more specific and much kind of softer tone. Calling a group of individuals the homeless or the projects. How about people that are experiencing homelessness instead? People who are in an emergency shelter. And just a few last notes looking at this kind of general principles for reducing bias. Focus on relevant characteristics. Maybe gender identity isn't important. There's no need then to focus in on that. Maybe race isn't important. No need to focus in on that then. But you want to acknowledge the relevant differences that do exist, and relevant is the key. You want to be appropriately specific. And then specific age ranges as well. If that's included, that's probably important. You wouldn't, especially in your war activities, you wouldn't remove that from the sentence. You'd keep that age range there, but use the appropriate term to describe them. Like, again, 15 to 18-year-olds would be adolescents. 65 to 80-year-olds would be older individuals. Be sensitive to labels. So again, the language that's labeling, there's that person first language to avoid that, where you say people with whatever that disability may be, even doing that for socioeconomic status, and different types of things. And again, just one more pointing out here, this example uses normal may prompt a conversation with comparison for abnormal and thus stigmatizing individuals. Instead, find terms that avoid using that word normal. to avoid that bias language. All right, well, I hope that helps on your war activity.